Have you ever heard of the tragedy of Darth Plagueis the Wise? He was a Sith Lord, so powerful in the dark side that he could manipulate the midichlorians in such a way as he could create life. He could even prevent those he loved from dying. But his apprentice killed him in his sleep. For the one person he could not help was himself. Or so we are told. Now there are rumors that Darth Plagueis survived his execution at the hands of his apprentice, Darth Sidious, also known as Palpatine, the Emperor of the Empire. Or that he revived himself from the dead and went under the name Snoke, and there took over the First Order, corrupting the nephew of Luke Skywalker into Kylo Ren and rising up. Yes, Snoke is Darth Plagueis, the Sith Lord. Or at least this is a very popular fan theory. My name is S.K. Williams, and I would like to discuss this Darth Plagueis theory, if you will. But before I begin, I should like to tell you a bit about myself for those who haven't really listened to any of my videos before, or at the very least none of my Star Wars ones, which there aren't that many. I was one of the first persons to produce a negative review of The Last Jedi. I did so back in December. I had promised to do 3, but due to circumstance was unable to fulfill the other 2. And largely forgot about it because this channel is not a Star Wars channel or even a pop culture channel. It primarily deals in educational content. I'm going to upload my college coursework for assistance to people. I'm uploading the Bible right now that I'm personally reading. I intend on reading other sacred texts like the Quran and perhaps some Buddhist literature and things along those lines, and do some commentary. But pop culture today may become classical literature of tomorrow, so I do think that sometimes discussing things like Star Wars or Star Trek or Doctor Who does in fact relate to the purpose of this channel. However, this is still a bit of a departure for me because now I'm talking about a fan theory that may possibly work itself in, rather than primarily focusing on themes that would normally be approached in an academic setting. But still, I did say I would do videos like this from time to time. And what prompted me to do this was the news that Lucasfilm is considering making a popular fan theory into canon in Episode 9, and of course that fan theory, if you've listened to the introduction of this video, is the idea that Supreme Leader Snoke of the First Order and Master of Kylo Ren was really Darth Plagueis the Wise, the Sith Lord who had trained Darth Sidious, has now trained Kylo Ren to be a new Sith Lord himself. And of course, Kylo Ren fulfilled the tradition of the Sith by killing his master and claiming the title of Dark Lord of the Sith for himself, as is the way of the Sith. This theory is very popular, and many people support it for many reasons. For example, it's claimed that should Supreme Leader Snoke be revealed as Plagueis, it would be a way to connect all 3 trilogies into one, binding them into an overarching narrative. And others say it makes sense to do this, as it would explain why Snoke is so powerful. But I really don't like the Snoke theory. And as I said, I'm one of the people who did a negative review of The Last Jedi. I don't like The Last Jedi. But that doesn't mean I must like every fan theory that comes along either. And I don't really like this one. And I would like to take some time to explain why I don't, but I'll also look at some of the arguments for why it's good, or Some people even argue that Snoke being Plagueis was what J.J. Abrams had intended all along and had left clues leading up to this. Now, those clues are in 3 general categories: internal, external, and narrative. What do I mean by that? Well, an internal clue would be something built into the film itself to clue the audience in on this reveal. An external clue would be something from an interview or an official source book, but that is not really in the films themselves. And there's a bit of a gray area in terms of comic books and novels and tie-in literature, which is technically on film but not in the main films. You could place those in either category. Narratively, though, the narrative argument is more about themes, the themes of the film and directions they go and how well this idea would fit in, even if it was not originally planned, and I intend on going over all 3. But for now, I think that I should simply give you my perspective on this. I've always thought that there should be balance in storytelling, and the current debate in Star Wars has polarized people so much so that you are going to fall on one of 2 sides in most people's minds. You will either be a supporter of Rian Johnson and Kathleen Kennedy and think, out with the old, in with the new, let's do subversion of expectations is good, or else you are going to be on the side saying, give the fans what they want, everything they want, just listen to the fans and do everything the fans say. And I think that both of those sides are losing propositions. I loathed The Last Jedi. But the problems with The Last Jedi weren't simply that it wasn't the movie I expected. It was the fact that, even on its own, the movie didn't make much sense and made terrible decisions. And when trying to connect it to the rest of Star Wars, it just doesn't work. And there are numerous reasons why that is true. But it isn't true that it failed simply because it didn't cater to what the fans desired. On the other hand, you do have to give the audience what it wants. And that's going to be where I'm going to begin here, so you understand my perspective. I'll tell you why I hold this perspective, and I think you'll be able to understand it better, and at least, even if you're not convinced of what I'm saying, you can perhaps appreciate the perspective better. And I treat it like cooking. Now, not everyone likes the same food, just like not everyone likes the same sort of movies. And some of you who are listening may not like the food that I'm mentioning, but pretend you do, because I can't pick a single food that everyone is going to like. Suppose I invite you over for dinner. And I'm going to make vegetable soup, and I've told you that, and it's going to be a party of around 12 to 15 people, so I'm making a lot of it. And you get to my house, you sit down at the dining table, you're talking and having a good time with your party mates, some of which may be your friends, I don't know. And I come out with dinner, a nice steaming pot of vegetable soup, and I dip the ladle in and pour it into each bowl and give you a spoon, and steam falls away from each bowl, rising up, and it smells good and it looks good, and you put your spoon into the bowl and you put it in your mouth, and oh, your mouth tightens up and you will either swallow hard or spit it out. Because it has way too much salt in it. Not just a little too much, but way too much. It's as if I went to the ocean and got seawater to make this in. It is saturated with salt. I have just served you the Dead Sea of vegetable soups. And you don't like it. Not because you don't like vegetable soup, but because you don't like the fact that I put way too much salt in it. However, Most forms of vegetable soup that you will serve will have some sort of seasoning, including salt, in them. It is possible to make a delicious tasting vegetable soup without salt, but most of the time salt will be added to enhance the flavor, and the problem isn't adding salt. The problem is how much of it I added. If I had added no salt at all, the soup would have been bland. It would not have been very flavorful. It may taste okay, but all you're really getting is a bunch of steamed vegetables which are swimming in a bowl of tomato-infused water. It wouldn't taste particularly flavorful or be particularly exciting. But in this case, I suppose bland is better than oversaturated, since at least it remains edible. And that's how I view The Last Jedi. As much as I hated it, I don't hate every single solitary thing about it, and think some things were good in it. And I think that there were some good ideas that were poorly executed. I also don't think that Lucasfilm should just ignore the fans altogether and do whatever it wants. But by the same token, I don't think that Lucasfilm, or any studio at all, for that matter, should make a film based solely on fan expectations and based solely on fan theories, especially in a long-running franchise. And the reason is because then you get The Force Awakens, a rehash of A New Hope. People complained about that, and I will defend Lucasfilm on this point. They are right on one thing. When The Force Awakens came out, people complained that it didn't do anything new. It just gave us the same old. And then Rian Johnson comes along and gives us something bold and new, and we hate that too. It sometimes looks impossible to please people. But I don't think it really is. I think that the problem isn't that you gave the fans some familiar things that they wanted. Nor is the problem with The Last Jedi that it decided to subvert expectations. The problem is that Rian Johnson added too much salt to the soup he gave us. He also, for some reason, decided to add sugar, which doesn't work well with vegetable soups. And that's the point. Rian Johnson's primary mistakes in The Last Jedi can be boiled down to two things. He added too much salt, and he should not have added sugar. By which I mean he added too much subversion of expectations, and he also added ingredients that should not be there. But by the same token, doing something new with the soup, adding a vegetable people haven't eaten before, adding a new variation of the spices that go into it, may make the dining experience all the more enjoyable. And that's how I'm approaching this topic. Not as someone who wants to castigate The Last Jedi and current Lucasfilm as if nothing they do is right. And not as someone who thinks that pandering to the fans is the only way forward, but also not as someone who thinks that the fans should be ignored. Because that doesn't work either. Indeed, Lucasfilm's approach seems to be based upon them looking at the past. Loads of people complained about the prequel trilogy, and yet they still went and watched the movies. Some people watched them multiple times, and they gave Lucasfilm money. So it doesn't matter if you complained about The Last Jedi, you still gave them money. So they believed the same would be true here. And yes, I know, The Last Jedi made less money than The Force Awakens, but if your narrative is that the backlash isn't real, and this isn't just something you put in the media, you could justify that simply by the fact that The Force Awakens had an advantage. It was the first Star Wars movie in several years, and a lot of hype was built up around it, and you just can't generate that with a second film, and I think that that's what they were viewing. That's how they interpreted the data. Now that Solo has bombed at the box office, And now that Star Wars toys just won't be sold, and Star Wars is a declining property, now they acknowledge the existence of the backlash. And it's obvious that Lucasfilm is in a state of desperation right now. You see, Lucasfilm is doing things now specifically to recapture the core audience. One thing they're doing is reviving the Clone Wars series and making 2 new seasons, and it was cancelled 5 years ago. Please don't misunderstand what I'm saying here. I loved the Clone Wars when it was on, but it is highly unusual to see a show get cancelled and 5 years later it be revived. I mean, it's not the longest gap between revivals. Doctor Who went off the air back in the 80s and came back in 2005. But it's not common. Typically, if a show's been off the air for a few years, it doesn't return. You may go back to that world, but it's a different show. It's something like Star Trek The Next Generation. It was made about 20 years after Star Trek was cancelled on NBC, and while they were still making feature films, there was no new Star Trek TV show. But they didn't just bring it up as Star Trek and put Kirk in there and pretend it's the next season of Star Trek. It was an entirely different show. It was set in the same world, but it was an entirely different show. And that's what you would expect with the Clone Wars. And it's kind of what you got. You got Rebels right afterward. Whether you loved the Clone Wars or not, it doesn't matter. Disney's administration of Lucasfilm cancelled the Clone Wars because it was airing on a rival network and they had no control over it, and because Kathleen Kennedy wanted to take Star Wars in a new direction. So reviving the Clone Wars is simply an attempt at getting the audiences back that they have lost, and it is a sign of desperation on the part of Lucasfilm. Now, some of you may think that that's a good thing, and if they're doing this, they're listening to the fans finally, and they'll give you what you want. The problem is with overcompensation. If all you do is try and give the fans what you want, you will still create problems because not all fans want the same things. There is no way every fan theory can possibly be true. So you'll have to pick one. And even if it's the most popular one, the second most popular one may still have a significant following. And the way you execute it may not even please all of the people who believed in the fan theory. Ultimately, it's a losing game. But the worst part about it is, if all you do is pander to existing audiences and all you ever do is give them what they ask for and what they demand and what their fan theories say, then you won't have anything new. Because most of the fans are not professional writers, and most of the fans do not have the imaginations of professional writers. I'm not saying that to insult the fans. In fact, I think that with Lucasfilm insulting the fans is terrible. But it is simply a fact. We all have strengths and weaknesses, and just like how most people aren't going to be professional chefs, go back to my food analogy, while most people can cook a simple meal, they're not necessarily going to create an elaborate one. Most people cannot write a story that is compelling and good. Most people are just not writers. Most people don't have the broad imagination that writers have. That isn't an insult. It is simply part of humanity. We all have different talents. And whether or not you think the writers at Lucasfilm are good, and I myself don't think that they've necessarily hired the best lot of writers, the simple truth is that most of them will still have at least a little more imagination than the average moviegoer, or even the average Star Wars fan. That's not to say that no one in the Star Wars fandom can be imaginative. There are plenty of people with strong imaginations and even strong skills in writing. There are people in the Star Wars fan community who are just as good, if not better, than the average Hollywood screenwriter, but they are not the majority. And I'm reiterating this over and over again to put it in people's mind that I'm not trying to insult you, but you do need to understand this. Because People who don't have a broad scope of imagination will often fall back on the familiar, and they don't have a clear understanding of story structure. Rather, like most people, aren't carpenters and don't necessarily understand everything about building the foundation of a house, or what will go where, or how strong something needs to be load-bearing. They don't understand all the mechanics of it. All they know is that they thought character X was really cool and they want character X back, or character Y might be hiding something. So, if you just listen to fan theories and just give the fans what they want, if all you do is scour the internet and read Reddit posts and watch YouTube videos and incorporate these ideas into your films, then all you're going to end up with at the end of the day are movies that are comprised of nothing but bullet points, with a story that exists to do nothing more than to get you to the next fan moment. You won't have a compelling story. You will have a story that is an excuse to show you things you already know. And it will also become very stale because there's nothing new. As much as I hated The Last Jedi, I do agree with Rian Johnson on some things, and one of the things I most agree with him on is that Star Wars will eventually need to embrace new concepts. It will eventually need to do something new. If you don't, then you'll end up with more movies like The Force Awakens. The Force Awakens could be fun, but it's just a rehash of A New Hope, and over time, if all you get is rehashed storylines, you will get bored with it. Now, that's not to say I think Rian Johnson did a good thing. But the problem with Johnson isn't that he was taking the story in a new direction. The problem is that he disregarded the previous one or tried to undermine previous films and characters. His treatment of Luke wasn't wrong simply because it didn't fit our expectations. It was wrong because it contradicted what had come before in the minds of the audience. Indeed, going back to my soup analogy, people expect carrots to be in a bowl of vegetable soup, and Luke Skywalker was the carrot. You should have made him how fans expected him to be, because he doesn't need to be different. If you want to put a twist on him, explain why he's on the island and make that something the fans didn't necessarily predict. Maybe do like Logan. Have Rey hand him the lightsaber and have him take it. And then have her ask why he put himself on that island. Why is he hiding? And he can explain to her he's old and he's dying. Maybe he left the map with Lor Santeca, so he would give it to someone who is strong in the Force, whom he can train to be the new hero. This way it subverts the expectation because we expect Luke to be a hero, and he's not anymore. But it doesn't ruin his previous character. The reason Luke isn't a hero is a perfectly understandable one. It's something that happens to all of us if we live long enough. He simply got too old and is no longer capable of being the hero. So he transitioned from his role as hero to his role as mentor, and now he will pass the torch on to a new generation. He will teach Rey to use the Force, and teach Rey to be that hero. A hero like he once was, and a hero like he still is mentally. But a hero unlike what he is physically capable of doing now. If he had left the map so that Lor Santeca can give it to a prospective student, someone he foresaw using the Force, someone he knew would come, I think the fans would have reacted more positively. Especially if it was well done. People would understand that Luke is no longer a hero, but it isn't because he's a coward. It's because he is an old man who can't be. Perhaps even make it more drastic. Perhaps he's on that island not just for the first Jedi Temple, but because there's something on the island that will, while not continue him indefinitely, enable him to suppress his disease and allow him to last long enough to train that future hero. If he leaves the island, he will deteriorate much faster. He cannot leave the island without dying. Perhaps not instantaneously. Perhaps he can get on the Falcon and visit Leia at the end of the film, and maybe it's an herb he's eating and he can take a few of them with him, but the herbs only grow on Octu and cannot grow anywhere else. Perhaps. And if you were taking it in that way, you are still giving the audience what they expect. You are giving them Luke Skywalker, an optimistic and hopeful man, and a man who is courageous and heroic. But you're not giving them what they expected to see in Luke. He isn't someone who will take his lightsaber and go fight Kylo Ren himself, because he no longer can. Perhaps his hand shakes and he can't use a lightsaber anymore. Old man Luke, who isn't simply grumpy Luke who has given up on the Jedi, would make a better Luke. And that's sort of what I'm driving at. Don't just pander to the fan theories. Don't make Luke this powerhouse who can do anything and who goes in and beats up the First Order. Take that away from him. He's still powerful in the Force, but his body is simply old and he is frail and dying, and if he continues to use the Force in that way, he will simply not endure. And if you did it that way, you could subvert the expectations of the audience whilst still staying true to his character. And the same is true of all the other problems in the film. And the same is true of all other films. I think that you can give the fans things they want to see, while at the same time giving them new things to fall in love with. And if they don't fall in love with the new thing, you can scrap it. Eventually you'll find something that does. But you don't have to destroy the past to do that. And that's going to bring us back to the topic at hand. It doesn't seem like it, because I started this video about a Snoke being Plagueis. So what does all of this have to do with that? Well, if you listen to the end of this video, you will find out. And I know this video is long. I know that. But please bear with me. The idea that Snoke is Darth Plagueis would be catering to a fan theory in a negative way. It means that you will not have new things in Star Wars. Star Wars will forever be the struggle between the Jedi and the Sith. Lord Snoke will be Darth Plagueis. He will be a Sith Lord. And he trained Kylo Ren to be a Sith Lord, and the fans will be right about him. To become a Dark Lord of the Sith, you must kill your master. And Kylo did that. Kylo did that to become the Dark Lord of the Sith, and eventually he will take an apprentice who will have to kill him unless he gives up being a Sith Lord. And it's all very Sithy and the same. But it's not a new philosophy. And one of the most interesting aspects about the Clone Wars TV show is that it showed other dark side users, like the Night Sisters, who in no way operated like the Sith. And that's kind of what I want to see in Snoke myself. I want to understand the dark side philosophy he uses. But no, if he's Darth Plagueis, he's just a Sith. And that's kind of the problem. It will lead to a sort of inbreeding. And it's the kind of inbreeding that irritates me, but also frustrates me when I deal with fans, because a lot of fans will criticize the scene at the end of Revenge of the Sith, where it's revealed that Yoda personally knew Chewbacca, Han Solo's co-pilot. This was horrible, and it made the galaxy feel way too small. And yet they're okay with this. They're okay with Snoke being Darth Plagueis, someone we've heard of before. It's the same thing. The Star Wars galaxy doesn't feel that big. It feels like it's 30 miles across. Everyone knows everyone else. And that's one of the major problems with it. But the idea that Darth Plagueis is actually Snoke, and that Snoke has been Plagueis this whole time, has other problems that I will get into at the end of this video. But like I promised, I will go into the arguments for why he is Snoke, and why he should be. And I shall start with the should be. A lot of people think that Snoke should be Darth Plagueis, and they argue that if he is Darth Plagueis, it would tie all three trilogies together, giving a continuity between the prequel series, the original series, and the sequel series. There is also an argument that if Snoke ends up being Darth Plagueis, it would explain why he is so powerful. And it would be a way of tying in prequel continuity and giving it meaning and purpose. And I don't agree with either of those arguments. For example, the argument that says that if Snoke is Darth Plagueis, it would tie all three trilogies together is nonsense. I don't mean to insult those who like that argument, but it is absurd. And it is absurd for a few reasons. The first being that Snoke is not mentioned in the original trilogy, and by Snoke I mean Darth Plagueis. In fact, the Sith aren't mentioned in the original trilogy. That may sound strange coming to it from the modern perspective of Star Wars, even when George Lucas owned it. But think about it. The word Sith never appeared in any of the three original films. There was no indication that Darth Vader was anything other than a dark Jedi, or someone who used the dark side. And the same is true of Palpatine. I think people intuitively understood that he was never a Jedi, but there was no expectation that he belonged to some long, ancient order of dark side users. That's not to say when the concept of the Sith was introduced into Star Wars and became canonical, that it was bad. It wasn't. It gave explanation, and it didn't really contradict anything that had already existed. But in the context of this discussion, if Snoke ends up being Darth Plagueis, it simply doesn't connect the original trilogy in any meaningful way to the sequels. It only does so in an indirect way because Darth Plagueis happened to be the teacher who taught Palpatine the ways of the Sith. But in as far as the original trilogies are concerned, that is ultimately irrelevant. We spent many years without ever hearing the name Darth Plagueis and without knowing who taught him the ways of the dark side and the ways of the Sith later on. We don't need Darth Plagueis to have ever existed in order to make sense of the original trilogy. His influence only exists retrospectively through Palpatine's story being expanded in the prequels. So while Snoke being Darth Plagueis would connect the sequel trilogies thematically to the prequels, it would do nothing to the original films. And it would mean nothing to the original films. And as for explaining why Snoke is so powerful, you can be a powerful Force user and not be Darth Plagueis. That isn't the only reason that could possibly exist for why he is so powerful in the Force. So those arguments don't really work for me. They don't really give a reason why he can't be Darth Plagueis. After all, simply because you don't need to be Darth Plagueis to be powerful doesn't mean that Darth Plagueis wasn't powerful or that it wouldn't fit. And just because the argument is not true that Snoke being Darth Plagueis would connect all three trilogies, it still doesn't inherently alter these movies, does it? Well, it actually does, but I haven't explained why yet. The point is, if Snoke ends up being Darth Plagueis, if you just went by what I said now, it wouldn't be harmful to Star Wars, but it wouldn't be helpful to it either, and it's not a particularly justified decision. It wouldn't be done to serve the narrative, it would only be done to pander to fans. A justifiable decision in terms of narrative, it would only be done to pander to fans and fan theories. It wouldn't actually serve the story in any way. Now, some people think it would serve the story, and in fact, some people think that J.J. Abrams had intended Snoke to be Darth Plagueis the whole time. I don't believe that is true, and I'll explain why later, but as it stands right now, it just wouldn't serve the narrative, even if Abrams had wanted this all along, because Rian Johnson did not follow Abrams' outline, so even if Abrams had intended that, it simply wouldn't matter now. After all, Lucasfilm is basing Episode 9 off of the events of Episode 8. The events of Episode 9 will follow the events of Episode 8. That means that, in order to retain some sense of continuity, they will need to build off of those events. And like I said, I don't think Abrams had intended Snoke to be Darth Plagueis anyway, but let's be honest, what does it gain you? Snoke being Darth Plagueis doesn't actually add anything to the story narratively. Now, granted, just because something doesn't add to the narrative doesn't inherently make it wrong. Because you can always say it adds to the fun of the movies, even if it doesn't mean anything. However, there are those who legitimately argue that should Snoke be Darth Plagueis the Wise, then it would connect all three trilogies, binding them together. And that just isn't true. You see, Snoke isn't mentioned in the original trilogy. Neither is Darth Plagueis. Indeed, the Sith aren't even mentioned. That may seem strange to say nowadays, because we know Darth Sidious was a Sith Lord, as was Darth Vader, but if you watch the original three movies, the word Sith is never used. There is no indication that there even is such a thing called the Sith Order, or that there was a Darth Bane and a rule of two. There was no indication that should Palpatine and Vader have successfully turned Luke to the dark side, then one of them would have to die to maintain the rule of two. All of that was invented later. When the original Star Wars trilogy was made, the concept of the Sith did not exist. They were simply dark side users, with Darth Vader being a fallen Jedi. It is true that it was later revealed that Darth Vader was originally Anakin Skywalker, but there is no indication that Darth was even supposed to be a Sith title. It could just be that Anakin Skywalker changed his name to Darth Vader, with Darth being his first name, and this is really what the first movie would have been written like, since Obi-Wan keeps referring to him as Darth, as if it is his name and not his title. And that's the point. The idea that if Snoke is Darth Plagueis, it would connect all of the films is not really true, at least not in a direct way. I suppose you could argue that it would connect all of the films indirectly. That because Darth Plagueis created Anakin, then that thread goes through it. And because Darth Plagueis trained Darth Sidious, who became the Emperor, there's that connection. But it really is a tenuous connection that thematically isn't there, because even in the prequels, Darth Plagueis just isn't important. In fact, there's nothing in the prequel films that even indicates that Darth Plagueis was the master of Emperor Palpatine. That was a fan theory that became canon, much like how Snoke being Plagueis might become canon. And to be honest, I don't even like that. I accept it, but I don't like it. And even if I loved the idea, I would still have to be honest with myself and admit that when George Lucas wrote the script for Attack of the Clones, he did not intend Darth Plagueis to be Darth Sidious's master. In fact, he probably didn't even give much thought into who Darth Plagueis was outside of the plot device to help turn Anakin to the dark side. He may not have even existed. He could just be a legend. It was the fans that latched onto the name Darth Plagueis and made it what it is today. That's not to say that every time a fan theory is incorporated into a work it is bad, but at the same time, it's not really justified most of the time, even though people will say it is, or that it was implied. For example, if you rewatch Attack of the Clones in the scene where Palpatine is talking to Anakin, and he brings up Darth Plagueis, and he tells him the story of Darth Plagueis the Wise, he calls it an ancient Sith legend. And I know defenders of the idea that Plagueis was always meant to be Sidious's master will say he couldn't just say he was my master because that would out him as a Sith Lord. And to an extent that's correct, but there is still no indication that he was referring to his own backstory, and no reason to assume he was. Fans decided it was. It was eventually incorporated into the expanded universe, and it became an accepted part of the lore from then on. But it was because the fans latched onto the story and the name of Darth Plagueis and began talking about it that this happened. And the same may happen with Snoke. Snoke may become Darth Plagueis more because of fans than because of what was originally intended or what is narratively sound. Now, Darth Plagueis being Darth Sidious's master doesn't really undermine anything. I think it was a stupid idea, since I think it should have been left as an ancient legend from days gone by that may not have even been true. But it doesn't actually alter anything, whereas Snoke being Plagueis has a fundamental change on Star Wars. And it's a fundamental change that people don't seem to really think about. You see, the Jedi had a prophecy that there would be a chosen one, and that the chosen one would destroy the Sith once and for all and bring balance to the Force. And if you're going to think like a Jedi, and the prophecy was made by a Jedi, you can't argue like most of the fans or like people at Lucasfilm seem to be arguing, that balance means having equal parts darkness and light, that the dark and light have to be there in equal quantity. Rather, the Jedi saw the light side of the Force as submission to the true will of the Force, and the dark side was an inherent imbalance. Darkness to the Jedi was like a disease in your body. It was something to get rid of. It was something that made you unhealthy. It was something that brought imbalance to the Force. The dark side itself was an imbalance to the Force, and the Jedi would restore balance by eliminating the darkness. To the Jedi, the light side was balance, and having all light is balance. And this isn't even up for debate or a claim that the Jedi misread the prophecy, and they may have thought light side was going to be that in order to have balance you need all light side, but it really meant equal parts light and dark. But that's not what makes sense, considering what George Lucas actually based Star Wars on. He based Star Wars on multiple things, such as the old serials of Flash Gordon and Japanese movies and old World War II movies. But in terms of the Force and the philosophy behind Star Wars and the Force and the Jedi, he He based it on a fusion between two real-world religions, Christianity and Buddhism. And in terms of light versus dark, both Christianity and Buddhism teach that evil is just a corruption of good. As C.S. Lewis said, evil is nothing but spoiled good. Good is the proper way things should work. It means that you have everything doing as it should, whilst evil would mean not doing something that is good. It means not doing things as they ought to be. So balance isn't having an equal parts darkness and light. Balance is having all light. It's what Buddhists would consider being enlightened and mindful, or what Christians would consider submitting to the will of God and living free of sin. The dark side is about rejecting God and embracing sin, or it's about refusing enlightenment and compassion and living only for selfish ends. The dark side of the Force is about subjugating the Force for your own desires rather than letting it guide you and doing as it would for you. So the idea that balance means equal parts darkness and light is something that doesn't really fit into the first 6 movies. I know the concept was, however, introduced in The Last Jedi. I know that Snoke said, darkness rises and light rises to meet it, but in addition to that being something Snoke said that may not be true, and I don't mean Snoke was lying, I mean he may believe something that isn't true, but it doesn't make sense in context of the previous 6 films. You see, in the previous films, we were told that Anakin Skywalker was the Chosen One, and George Lucas actually said the same thing. According to George Lucas, Anakin is the Chosen One. But if Snoke is Darth Sidious and a Sith Lord, then Anakin could not have been the Chosen One. You see, the Chosen One would destroy the Sith and bring balance to the Force, but Anakin failed to do that. So in addition to Luke Skywalker being a loser who failed at life, Anakin Skywalker is too. Sure, he did a good thing by killing the Emperor, but the Empire got reborn as the First Order and was led by the Emperor's old master, Darth Sidious. And Anakin didn't even destroy the Sith, since the Sith Order continues to exist through Darth Plagueis The Wise, who is going by the name Snoke now, and training a new order of Sith in Kylo Ren. And that's the problem. If we accept the idea that Snoke is Darth Plagueis The Wise, then we also have to accept that Anakin Skywalker was not the Chosen One, and that he ultimately failed at destroying the Sith. And there are only 2 in a position to do so now. Sith Lord Kylo Ren, and he would be a Sith Lord since he was trained as a Sith by a Sith Lord, or Rey. Either Kylo Ren will renounce the way of the Sith and return to the light and destroy the Sith Lords that way, or Kylo Ren will die by Rey's doing, or in order to save Rey because he's in love with her, or some such like that. Ultimately, though, Rey will be responsible for the events that will finally end the Sith Order. Which means that, in addition to being the foundress of the new Jedi Order, an order of Jedi that would go on to repopulate the entire galaxy as Jedi. In addition to the fact that Luke Skywalker is a failure, and his Jedi Order was destroyed and he gave up, but Rey, determined as she is, refused to give up and built a new Jedi Order and will be this grandiose thing. In addition to taking that away from Luke Skywalker and giving it to Rey, you are also taking away from Anakin Skywalker his role in the story as the Chosen One and giving it to Rey again. So Rey is both the Chosen One and she is the foundress of the new Jedi Order and the bringer of light for all the world. I don't really think that's a good idea. And if Snoke is Darth Plagueis, that's the only route to go unless you just ignore the prophecy altogether. And yes, I know, a prophecy that could have been misread, but again, it's a prophecy by the Jedi. You might misread some aspects of it, but you're not going to misread your own dogma of your own religion. So no, Snoke cannot be Darth Sidious without Anakin not being the chosen one. Now, some people have argued with me on that point and said that, well, maybe he used to be a Sith Lord, but he gave it up, like Darth Maul. The thing is, Darth Maul died. He died in Rebels. He was dead long before Return of the Jedi. And even if he hadn't died and we argued he's not a Sith, he was trained as one, and he is a remnant of their teachings. And he is still connected to the Sith Order. He can still open Sith holocrons, for example. And he said himself in Rebels that in order to open a Sith holocron, you have to think like a Sith. So he still thinks like one. And if you think like one and still embrace the teachings of the Sith, then whether or not the Dark Lord of the Sith removed your title, you are in essence a Sith. I'm not saying that someone cannot be a Sith and then renounce the Order, but Darth Plagueis would have had no motivation to cease to be a Sith. And it just doesn't add up. He can't have left the Order simply because Palpatine assassinated him, because he knew that that was what an apprentice would do. So why would he stop using the Darth title? Why would he stop being a Sith? If you do go that route, that he is no longer a Sith, and thus the prophecy is fine, it creates that problem. And it's a problem that is completely avoidable by simply saying he is not Darth Plagueis. Which brings up the other common argument that I hear about why he is Plagueis. And these deal with what we see in the movie or hear in the movie. When Snoke is talking to Anakin, they play the same music as was playing when Palpatine talks about Darth Plagueis. And in addition to that, when Han Solo was trying to convince his son, Kylo Ren, also known as Ben Solo, to return with him and give this up, Kylo Ren said, "The Supreme Leader is wise." Calling Snoke wise? You mean like Darth Plagueis the Wise? And I'm not kidding, people use that as evidence. Snoke was called wise, and so was Plagueis. So they must be the same person. And it's obvious that this is what J.J. Abrams intended. But I don't think that's really evidence. Films often use the same music repeatedly if they think it fits the theme. You don't typically find a long-running film series that composes new music for every different possible take, or for every new thing that comes along. So the Darth Plagueis music really probably was never even intended to be Darth Plagueis music, and people are just reading into it. And besides that, it was never really connected to Darth Plagueis. It was just scary music. It could just be dark side music. But what about calling him wise? What about saying the Supreme Leader is wise? Doesn't that hint that he's Darth Plagueis? I mean, Darth Plagueis was known as being wise. He's Darth Plagueis the Wise. Wasn't that foreshadowing? Not really. Not unless you also want to believe that Yoda is Darth Plagueis. You see, Yoda is considered the wisest character in Star Wars, or at least one of the wisest. And people have called him wise in various different media. What's more, Yoda's very name means wise. The Hebrew word for wise is Yod, and Yoda is a form of that makes it into a name. Yoda's name means wise. His very name means wise. Well, that clinches it. Yoda is Darth Plagueis, because Darth Plagueis is called wise. You see how ridiculous that is? Wisdom is a trait that more than one person possesses. Simply calling someone wise does not mean you are indicating that they are Darth Plagueis. Snoke can be wise and still be an independent person. There is no reason to assume that Snoke is Darth Plagueis just because he is called wise. That is an absurd logic. And finally, a lot of people argue that if he is Darth Plagueis, it would be far more interesting than if he's just this random nobody. Some have even said it's more creative and more original. Of course, onto the latter part, that doesn't make sense. How is it more original and creative to use Darth Plagueis, a name that already exists, than creating a new character? Even, I don't believe that saying it's not necessarily the most original of the two options means it's the worst. Sometimes the most original idea is not necessarily the best one for a story, but I've heard people say that making him Darth Plagueis was more original than making him a random nobody. But it's not. It's not more original. But that doesn't matter. Let's go to the more important part, that it would be more interesting. That's subjective, and it doesn't really lend any credence to the idea that he actually is. And that's the point. Snoke is in no way implied to be Darth Plagueis in the actual films we have seen him in. All of the evidence that he is Darth Plagueis the Wise stems entirely from fans making unjustifiable connections with minutiae and seeing patterns that are simply not there. Now, granted, there is talk that Disney is considering revealing that Snoke was Darth Plagueis the whole time. But again, this is an act of desperation on their part, much like reviving the Clone Wars. After the backlash of The Last Jedi, and after Solo failed to become profitable at the box office, becoming the first movie in the Star Wars franchise to ever bomb, Disney is desperate to win the audience back. It has gone into damage control mode, and pandering to fan theories is simply an effort to bring people back in. So, should Disney reveal that Snoke is Darth Plagueis, I will accept it in the same way that I accept that Plagueis is the master of Sidious, or at least is in the expanded universe. I don't think Disney has ever confirmed that in their new canon, but that's neither here nor there. I will accept it like I did with Plagueis, being Sidious's master, as something that I don't really think was justified, but that's there. And I will accept it because I have no choice but to accept it, because it will be a manifest reality. But that doesn't mean I'll like it, and it doesn't mean that the fans will be vindicated in their fan theories. It is still a theory that was created with no real justification. And it is still a concept that undermines certain themes within Star Wars. Now, some say that it was planned all along. Well, there's two problems with that. Let's assume it was planned all along. So what? Disney also threw out George Lucas's original ideas for episodes 7, 8, and 9. It wouldn't mean that George Lucas had intended this to happen, and it certainly wouldn't mean that George Lucas was trying to bind the prequels and the originals and the sequels by using Darth Plagueis as the glue that holds it all together. It would still be an idea outside of Lucas's original concept. But You may say it doesn't matter because we're talking only about the sequels and since Disney, but even then, there's no real evidence that they had planned this. The evidence comes from a few offhanded remarks in interviews or at conventions. Things like a fan at one of the conventions will ask a question saying, is Snoke Plagueis, or what do you think of that theory? And someone will trip over their words or say, I'm not allowed to say, and they take these words and expand them beyond what is needed. There is no clear-cut point where someone says Snoke was intended to be Plagueis. Some people even claim Rian Johnson had admitted that this was the original idea, because Johnson said something like this in an interview, that had Snoke stopped the action and told Rey that he was Darth Plagueis, she would have responded with, who? The name Darth Plagueis wouldn't have meant anything to Rey, so it really wouldn't make sense to have that kind of reveal in the movie. So some fans have looked at that interview and said, well, you see, Rian Johnson is admitting Snoke is Darth Plagueis, or at least that's what was originally intended for him. He just didn't say it because it didn't fit the story. But that's not what Johnson was saying. He was responding to the fan theory. It's not an admission that the fan theory was correct, either in his vision or in the original vision that Abrams had. It is simply speculation on what it would have been like if Snoke were Plagueis. If Snoke was Plagueis, would he really tell Rey that, and would it really make any difference to her? Would there be any reason to tell Rey this? That isn't an admission that Snoke was always supposed to be Plagueis. But people who want him to be Plagueis will cling to any little detail. And that's the point. There is no internal evidence in the films to suggest he is Darth Plagueis. The musical cues don't prove anything. And being called wise does not mean he is Darth Plagueis. There is no external evidence in any of the ancillary media, or in any of the interviews given. Just things taken out of context and distorted to mean something that people want them to mean. And there is no narrative justification for it. The only reason you should make Snoke into Plagueis would be to appease fans that are largely becoming disaffected by the course Star Wars has taken. It would be a cheap gimmick to get them back into the theater seats, and perhaps to get them to buy merchandise. But the truth is, there is simply no justification for it. And unlike making Darth Plagueis the teacher of Darth Sidious, making Snoke Plagueis would damage the overarching narrative. And I don't want it damaged. Some argue that if Snoke isn't Darth Plagueis, then he's just some nobody, and I disagree with that. You see, just because you're not someone we've already heard of before doesn't mean you're a nobody. Snoke can still be a powerful dark side user and not be Plagueis, just as he can be wise and not be Plagueis. He could use the dark side of the Force and not be a Sith Lord. There is no reason to assume he is a Sith Lord at all. In fact, all of the media up until then have flat denied that he is a Sith. The Star Wars sourcebook has said he is not a Sith. Wikipedia has an article on him that says he is not a Sith. Snoke is confirmed not to be a Sith. The two arguments used to get around that evidence, well, three technically. There are three arguments. One of them is to simply deny that they even say that, but I think that's done by people who are simply ignorant. But they do say that. Some people say that it's misdirection. Disney always intended Snoke to be Darth Sidious, but slapped that label on and say he's not, much like how Abrams claimed that Khan Noonien Singh would not be in Star Trek II of the reboot series, and yet the villain played by Benedict Cumberbatch was in fact Khan. And while that is possible, I just don't think it's likely, because when The Force Awakens came out, there was a legitimate desire while you are going to give the fans what they want to some extent, you are going to honor the story as it came before, so the Sith are just gone. But there's also a second argument people use. Again, it's one I've already brought up. That Darth Plagueis is no longer a Sith. But again, unless you give him a reason to have left the Sith Order, that doesn't really make sense. Especially since Plagueis is said to have wanted to abolish the rule of two as set forward by Darth Bane. But I think too many people associate dark side users with Sith, as if there's only two groups in Star Wars. There are the Sith and then there are the Jedi, but using the dark side of the Force does not mean you are a Sith. Just like using the light side of the Force does not automatically prove that you are a Jedi. So, I really don't buy that. And I don't like the argument. It's just pandering to the fans, and it destroys the narrative flow. It also brings about one final problem, and it's the last thing I will talk about in this video that is already over an hour. And that is originality. I disagree with Rian Johnson on most of his decisions for The Last Jedi, and on his philosophy on how he took Star Wars. But I do agree with him on one thing. Star Wars needs to go in a new direction. Eventually, you will not be able to fall back on the things you already know and are familiar with. You will need to introduce new elements to keep it fresh and relevant. And I agree. That doesn't mean I agree with Leia Poppins. It doesn't mean that I agree with Rey being a nobody. It doesn't mean that I agree with what he did with Luke. But I do agree that you need new ideas. In fact, I think that the first movie in the trilogy should have shown a powerful republic reversing the narrative altogether, because the idea of having a small, plucky band of underdog rebels against the mighty Empire has already been done, and it really doesn't make sense that only 30 or 40 years later, it's all starting over again. They should have taken Star Wars in a new direction right from the get-go, but they didn't. Introducing Snoke as a dark side user who isn't a Sith and has a different philosophy to the Sith could be interesting. You could explain what that philosophy is. You don't have to just repeat the Sith creeds and the Sith mantras and the Sith teachings. You could have a different kind of Darksider. A Darksider who's okay with teaching more than one apprentice. A Darksider who doesn't necessarily approach the use of the dark side as being solely about power. The use of the dark side for personal comfort and luxury, or to reshape the world. Perhaps have a dark side user that's more like Ayn Rand's objectivist, thinking you should use your talents to conquer the world, but not necessarily be conventionally evil in movie sense. You can still have a villain who uses the dark side, but who is compassionate. And in fact, Snoke attempted to show compassion to Kylo Ren in The Force Awakens. His personality is radically different between the two movies, and that's a problem that needs to be discussed as well, but we can discuss that another time if I ever do another video. But the point that I'm making now is there is simply no reason to retread the Jedi versus Sith struggle. You can just have Snoke as another ideology, so that in addition to having really cool lightsaber fights and the use of Force powers, you can have philosophical discussions about the differences. Just like you can have a philosophical discussion between the new Jedi Order and the old. Taking it in that way will expand the Star Wars universe organically. It would not necessarily take a dump all over the established Star Wars lore and throw it away like garbage, as The Last Jedi did. But it would do something that personally, I feel should be done. It would allow us to see a different perspective. One day, we won't be able to fall back on nostalgia. If for no other reason than the fact that retreading the same ground over and over and over again will get old. And besides, we've already lost Carrie Fisher in real life. And both Harrison Ford and Mark Hamill are very old. Even had they not been killed off in the films, time will eventually take them. Star Wars needs to develop new people and new concepts and new ideas. And making Snoke into Darth Plagueis doesn't do this. Now, again, I'm not saying that to justify The Last Jedi, because I didn't like that film. But you could have easily taken this in another direction. What I mean by that is, you could have done it like Star Trek. Star Trek The Next Generation was launched about 20 years after the original series had gone off the air. Granted, they were still making feature films with the original characters, but for all intents and purposes, Star Trek had been cancelled. So, it was brought back, and Gene Roddenberry was allowed to produce Star Trek The Next Generation. Now, there were problems with the first 2 seasons, but Star Trek The Next Generation is generally regarded as a great addition to Star Trek, as is Deep Space Nine, and while Voyager has a more mixed reception, it is generally regarded, even by those who hate it, as at least conceptually good, even if by execution it made a ton of mistakes. Enterprise was seen as a bit of a misstep, both because of its execution and because as a prequel it's very limited, but people tended to be more accepting of those things. But before all of those other expansions, we got The Next Generation. Now, I'm well aware that The Next Generation did bring back original characters. Dr. McCoy is in the first episode, for example, but that's just a cameo. It was there to establish that this is, in fact, the same world, but several years later. And yes, there are episodes where Spock comes back, and is a major part of the entire episode, and there's an episode where Scotty is brought back, and there are some episodes where they get back characters or ideas or concepts from the original series. For example, there's an episode of the original series called The Naked Time, and in it there is a disease that eliminates people's inhibitions, and The Next Generation has the same disease in an episode called The Naked Now. But for the most part, Star Trek The Next Generation came up with new script ideas and new stories. And the characters weren't just reboots of the old ones. Star Trek The Next Generation is truly a next generation. And they didn't try and make these characters into substitutes for the other ones. Picard was not made against the template of Captain Kirk. Riker was not Spock, and nor was Data. These characters were new characters, with their own personalities and their own backgrounds and their own goals and their own perspectives. And in the end, they forged their own identity that could stand alone, independent of the original Star Trek, even though they wouldn't exist without the original Star Trek. Almost like Star Trek The Next Generation is legitimately the child of the original Star Trek. You would not exist without your parents. But if your parents die after you are born, you can stand on your own as a person, and that is exactly what happened with The Next Generation. And what should have happened with The Next Generation of Star Wars characters. That's not to say we can't bring back anything from the past. In fact, we have to. Star Wars is not Star Trek. And when you're dealing with the saga films, there has to be a level of interconnectivity. There has to be a level of flowing continuity. But you can view it like a road, where in the prequels we focus on Anakin and Padme and Obi-Wan, but in the original trilogy, it's Han, Luke, and Leia, with Padme being dead, Obi-Wan being the mentor to Luke and then being killed, and Vader being Anakin, but now the villain and not the hero. And eventually, the story focuses around someone else, and we could do the same with Star Wars, the sequel trilogy. Luke, Han, and Leia could pass the torch on to Rey. We can start with something familiar that we already know and gradually move away from that which we know onto the new after it is established. Unlike Star Trek, you can't just start with a new series, but you can take it in new directions. And a good place to start would be a new villain, since, unlike the heroes, the villains only exist as obstacles to overcome. So coming up with a new villain shouldn't be that difficult. But if you make Snoke into Darth Plagueis, he's not really a new villain. He's just another Sith. And Star Wars runs the very real risk of becoming nothing but a series that relies on fan service. Instead of writing new stories that can be compelling and interesting, we will recycle story elements and plot lines from what was already extant. And new movies will become little better than a handful of fan references strung together with the least bit of story. Lucasfilm will scour the internet and read Reddit and watch YouTube videos and go to forums and chat rooms to find out what's popular with Star Wars fans and then just put them in, whether or not it's a good story. They will compile lists of what people want to see and then put all of those in a sort of lineup and come up with a story to justify while they're all in the movie. Ultimately, the storyline will come to serve the nostalgia and the fan service. It won't be the other way around. And the stories will be about nothing more than repackaging what we already know. And Star Wars will be meaningless after that. And I don't want that. And that's the very real danger we put Star Wars in if we make Snoke into Darth Plagueis. I've been speaking for 1 hour and almost 18 minutes, so I think I've made my case. I may make another Snoke Plagueis video to condense this argument or to make it a little clearer, maybe write a script because I did this off the top of my head, but I just thought I would make this video because it's something I've been thinking about. I don't have much more to add, so thank you. God bless, and goodbye.